Hello and welcome to Airheads, a not-so-serious look at the serious business of royal rumours, gossip and gowns. I'm Tom.
And I'm Maeve.
And welcome to our barely regal culture catch-up.
We're making up for taking 2 weeks off by doing 2 episodes in a week.
So, we have been kind of thinking about doing this episode for a while, and we got lots of good recommendations and suggestions from listeners, so thank you so much for sending those through. What we're going to be talking about on this episode is the drama It's a Sin, the film Promising Young Woman, and the series The Great. So we'll be spoiling everything in all of those.
Yeah, what we can do is we'll put the timestamps for each of them in the show notes. So if you haven't watched something yet, but you want to listen to another one, you can just pinpoint that part that's relevant. But let's go straight into our first, which is the Channel 4 miniseries, It's a Sin.
So we'll start with some royal reasoning, I think, for each of these.
I feel you have to justify yourself on your own podcast.
Yeah. Well, I didn't have to do any work for this, though, because listener Brian actually sent us an email outlining the reasons why we should talk about it. So thank you, Brian. He said, 1, it's contiguous with the early life of Diana, so we'll understand her better through understanding the 80s culture better. 2, the atmosphere of Thatcher in It's a Sin helps contextualise what we saw in The Crown. It's true. 3, Queen Victoria used to spend summers on the Isle of Wight, which is where the character Richie lives.
That was a bit of a reach. We're not going to be talking about Queen Victoria today.
And the 4th reason was that the theme of HIV and AIDS was the first subversive act of humanity Diana enacted, and that decision made her. It's a Sin helps us understand its import.
Definitely.
Yeah.
This show was created by Russell T Davies, who we are big fans of. He also made Queer as Folk, the original Queer as Folk, and he worked on Doctor Who. He did Years and Years, Cucumber Banana. He's done lots of things that we are big fans of, but this show centres on a cast of characters who have moved to London in 1981 for a variety of reasons, and all end up living together in a flat they call the Pink Palace.
So we have the main character, Richie, who's played by Ollie Alexander. He's moved from Queen Victoria's summer home, the Isle of Wight, to go to university in London. And when he's there, he realises he would rather study acting and that he wants to be an actor. And he also starts to experience life as an out gay man in London in the 80s.
Then there is Roscoe, my favourite, played by Omari Douglas, who's the highlight for me. We meet him as a construction worker who we see escaping from his religious parents before they can either throw him out or send him to Nigeria to be cured of homosexuality. And he makes this escape wearing a very glamorous skirt and makeup that is just the start of a whole series of incredible outfits that he wears throughout the rest of the show.
Yeah, it's so good. The third kind of main character is Colin, who's played by Callum Scott Howells. So he's a shy Welsh tailor who has a really touching relationship with his mother, which is like a real emotional cornerstone of the show, and who, after he's moved to London, is encouraged out of the closet by Neil Patrick Harris.
Neil Patrick Harris's character, not playing himself. His accent is a bit distracting, but I thought that relationship was a really important way of illustrating the sort of intergenerational cross-section of the queer community, because we see Richie's world, which is all these young guys in bars, but Colin is a very shy guy. He doesn't have very many friends. He doesn't know very many people in London, so having this sort of older mentor figure is very important for him and serves as a reminder, a broader reminder of the generation of potential role models that was lost, that was taken by AIDS.
Yeah, and in particular, Neil Patrick Harris's character serves as like a counterpoint to Colin's boss, who's this very predatory older man who's obsessed with washing him and who like takes him on that trip to New York. But I feel like there's a real stereotype about the older predatory gay man, so it's really important to have this like really positive figure who totally changes Colin's life for the better by showing him how he can be himself.
Yeah, and they have such a warm, fond relationship that when he dies, that death hits so hard.
Especially as we've seen Neil Patrick Harris's character and his partner of 30 years living as, to all intents and purposes, a long-term or married couple in all but like name and documentation. And when this illness strikes them both down, they have no recourse to the kinds of safety nets that straight couples would have had in the country at the time.
The fourth character that's flatmate in Pink Palace is Ash. Hunky Ash, played by Hunky Nathaniel Curtis.
He's very hunky.
Also studying in London, and to whom Richie almost loses his virginity.
And he would have done it if he'd known how to wash his bum.
And not talk in incredibly embarrassing racist terminology.
Yeah.
Ash becomes a teacher and later Richie's boyfriend.
The final flatmate is Jill, played by Lydia West, who she's initially one of Ash's friends, and then she notices Richie eyeing him up at university and introduces them. But once they've left university, she becomes very involved with AIDS activism very early on in the kind of movement in the UK. And as the series goes on, she visits men who are dying of AIDS, and she helps them, getting groceries and just the very basic things that they're not able to do. In particular, the character Gregory, or Gloria, who's like the first of their close circle to die from AIDS, and we see his struggle with the disease through Jill's eyes when she is kind of helping him, and even actually trying to find him in hospitals because of the kind of fake names that people would give. And we see as well the very common kind of perception that people would just move away from London and they would never come back. Like, they would just vanish home to their parents, and never return, which is really, it's devastating, and it's very movingly done by Russell T Davies, I think.
It's a Sin focuses mainly on the cis gay male community, and there are no queer women, no explicitly queer women in this show, and barely any trans or non-binary people either. And one of the things I saw was that around the time the show was on, there was obviously a lot of searches related to HIV, and one of them was, can women get AIDS? Because women are so erased from this storyline outside of the sort of caregiver role that we see Jill defined by in the show. But it focuses very sharply on the gay male community and the devastating impact that AIDS and HIV had on that community in the 80s through to the early 90s.
And it intertwines that story as it has to with the politics of that time in the UK, and in particular Margaret Thatcher's Section 28 law that made it illegal to promote homosexuality in schools. Obviously Ash ends up becoming a teacher, and he sees how the library at school contains no references to gay people at all. It kind of provides this link between people right at the top, adults at the top in government, and how their views of gay people and what they think about sex are being channeled straight down to children who are still forming their own ideas and who may be gay or queer, and so Russell T Davies does take care to include that in the narrative.
And there have been a lot of really major stories about AIDS, things like Angels in America, The Inheritance, that 2-part play that came out recently. But what this show is doing for the first time on mainstream television is showing what the AIDS crisis looked like in the UK. And we see the characters hearing about it happening in America almost as this sort of urban legend, and it makes it easier for them to ignore it for a while. And Russell T Davies has spoken about how that reflects his own experience growing up, living in London in the 80s and just wanting to ignore it because it was so depressing.
It also, like, this distance between the UK and America, it shows how difficult it made it for organisers like Jill to actually gather resources and to learn more about AIDS and HIV. Like, she has to actually ask Colin to physically look for and bring back pamphlets about HIV and AIDS from New York when he goes on this business trip with his boss. And I do feel like that is almost a difficulty that could pass younger viewers by, that they might not have thought. But, like, there's no internet. You can't just look up
Grandpa, okay.
Yeah, like in my day we had to go to New York and get the pamphlets ourselves, like, but I did think it was a good point to make.
Yeah, and Russell T Davies wrote a really interesting piece for The Guardian or The Observer about why he wanted to tell this story now, and in particular why he avoided addressing the AIDS crisis in his earlier work, notably in Queer as Folk, which is a real celebration of the joys of gay sex and gay relationships and that whole community, but which nobody uses condoms. There's no discussion of protection or testing or AIDS. The words AIDS and HIV are never mentioned, and he said that was very purposeful. It makes sense watching this that the character of Richie seems to be apparently modelled on Russell T Davies' own experience.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that Russell T Davies is as selfish as Richie necessarily comes across in this, but, like, Richie presents as, like, incredibly charming, very selfish, and we see him loudly denouncing AIDS activists in a pub because, like you say, because it's depressing, and he doesn't want it to hear it in a space that he associates with celebration and joy. And that really does chime with what Russell T Davies has said about his own experiences at the time. We get some other indications of Richie's selfishness. One of the biggest, obviously, being that he voted for Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by this. Thatcher isn't the focus of the show. We only see, like, her briefly from behind. Like, as well as that, the show doesn't really explore the mindset of gay Tories, although we do see Stephen Fry's character, who is a fictional Tory MP who sleeps with Roscoe.
Yeah, and also gets a hard-on for Thatcher. But, like, with Stephen Fry's character, it's fairly clear why his allegiances would be with Thatcher.
Yeah.
Like, he's privately educated, very much part of an elite group. You can tell, his attitudes towards, like, the economy and poor people and everything. But it would have been more interesting to get an exploration of the appeal of Thatcher to someone like Richie, who, like, lives in what I would have thought the Tories would consider to be, like, a countercultural environment. And it would be nice to see how it affects or doesn't affect his relationships with his friends.
Yeah, and I think particularly for younger people watching now, it would be so shocking to think that you would be friends with and living with someone who voted for someone like Thatcher.
Yeah.
And, politics is obviously different now, but I think that would have been something that could have benefited from further elaboration. As well as that, I think, I don't know if I would say that Thatcher gets off lightly, but the fact that the conclusion to the Thatcher element of the show is Roscoe pissing in her tea.
Yeah.
I think there should have been more.
Yeah, Thatcher and the government get off virtually unscathed in this show, I would say, compared to what the show levels at parents, for example. But despite the selfishness of Richie, he inspires, like, a lot of love and a huge amount of loyalty from his friends, in particular Jill, who's there through thick and thin for him. She, like we said, does a lot of work with AIDS activists, charities and support groups, and even when Richie is very dismissive of the work that she's doing, she manages to like balance that part of her life and her love for Richie. But she's modelled on a real life activist and friend of Russell T Davies, Jill Nalder, who is in the show and plays Jill's mum.
Jill gets to deliver the big moment in the final episode in the major scene with Richie's mother, who is played by Keely Hawes in a pretty remarkable performance.
Yeah, like Keely Hawes definitely does like a 180 in that final episode, or turns it up to 11 or something, because that performance, she's really giving it everything.
And Jill gives it to her. She says, actually, it is your fault, Mrs. Tozier. All of this is your fault, right from the start. I don't know what happened to you to make that house so loveless. That's why Richie grew up so ashamed of himself. And then he killed people. He was ashamed. He kept on being ashamed. He kept shame going by having sex with men, infecting them, and then running away. Because that's what shame does, Valerie. It makes him think he deserves it. The wards are full of men who think they deserve it. They are dying. A little bit of them thinks, yes, this is right. I brought this on myself. It's my fault because the sex that I love is killing me. I had some issues with this.
Yeah, I mean, suddenly in this final episode, I felt shame becomes really like the laser focus of the series. How it's cultivated in society from the very top, like we said, through the Section 28 and stuff. But then, especially in this final episode, how it's reinforced and dispersed by parents, and then how they are then responsible for it spreading throughout the community.
Yeah, I think it's better to refer to a queer man to talk about this. Brian Mullen is a queer American theatre maker who lives and works in London and has been living with HIV for 30 years, and he has written about the ways in which It's a Sin obsesses over shame, and the ways in which, as he puts it, structures of blame and mysteries of transmission drive the narrative.
Yeah, for him, It's a Sin continues this cycle of assigning blame that's really common in representations of people with AIDS. It's like a process of finger-pointing, trying to find villains to blame, when, in reality, as he puts it, HIV is a virus, not a moral agent.
Yeah, and he points out that the logic of that big finale monologue that Jill gives, the idea that shame is passed from homophobic parents and that that's the real villain, that doesn't even really stand up in the world of the show, because as we've seen, Colin's relationship with his mother is this unconditional, non-judgmental love and acceptance, but he still contracts and dies of AIDS. And I think one of the big problems is the way that Russell T Davies handles that story, and that he uses Colin's story to take viewers through a seemingly endless list of punishments for people with AIDS under the guise of treatment. We see him locked in hospital rooms with food left outside. He's denied visitors. He has basically all his rights stripped away. And I think on top of that, though, there's the question of how Colin contracted the virus and how the show treats that as a kind of whodunit mystery.
And like, it's a question that Colin's mother and Jill both dismiss as unimportant. I think Jill says something like, it'll just be some bloke.
Yeah.
You know. But the show clearly doesn't really agree with what they're saying. Like, as Brian puts it, the question is not ignored by Davis and his editing team, who, immediately after Jill's pronouncement, serve up two potential villains. As in any good mystery, the clues were there from episode 1. And, you know, he talks about how we get these, like, mumbled references from Colin to a rugby shirt, and then they do these flashbacks to that the quiet son of his former landlady, and then we get a scene of that landlady visiting a hospital where her son is being treated for HIV or AIDS.
Yeah, and it just felt, like you were saying, unnecessary, and like it was sort of cheapening the narrative.
Yeah, it's clearly important to Russell T Davies to solve this mystery, and that's fairly disappointing, I thought. But if Colin is like this good boy who's been doomed by just one sexual encounter, Richie's obviously meant to be a counterpoint to that. I think like it's important to say that Russell T Davies' ability to capture the joy and excitement of discovering life within the queer community is a real strength of his. And, you know, like you said, in his other shows like Queer as Folk and Cucumber, that's such a big part of that. And I do think it's, it's really good to show the good times that these characters have. But Brian notes that by the time he's in the hospital, Richie has internalized so much homophobia that he implicates himself as his own patient zero for continuing pathologically to have unprotected sex. He quotes Richie saying, "I knew it was wrong and I kept on doing it. I wonder how many I killed."
Obviously, it makes sense to explore that kind of guilt, but that logic isn't refuted. And like we discussed, Jill just picks it up and aims at a new target. That Richie is a killer, but it's his mother's fault.
Yeah.
And Brian says that Davies, through Jill, paints a portrait of young men so crippled by homophobia that they lack any responsibility or ethics and pursue sex as a symptom of shame. Davies' representation of the epidemic elicits pity rather than solidarity and ultimately offers a narrow, hopeless view of Britain's queer community to its huge audience.
Which is kind of worrying, I think, especially because it seems like a show aimed at people with fairly little knowledge of the AIDS crisis. And that's, whether that's straight people or if it's like young queer people who don't know that much about it, like possibly because there's a whole generation of older queer people who aren't around to talk about it.
Yeah, and I would say, Brian dislikes this show a lot more than I did.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
I thought it was a really powerful show. I thought it was brilliant that it was on Channel 4. So many people were watching about it. So many people were talking about it. It was very hard to watch. We watched it. We tried to binge it because I knew, I find AIDS stories just really harrowing. So wanted to just watch it all and sit with it in one go. And I think the kind of further away you get from it and from that really intense emotional response that you had watching it, you do have more kind of questions and doubts about it. And, it's been, 4 months since we watched it?
Yeah.
So, I don't mean to sound so negative on it, but there are, I think, some very valid criticisms in Brian Mullen's essays about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, we found it, super fun to watch the scenes, early on with them, meeting for the first time and,
clubbing.
The clubbing and the parties and, how excited they were to be in the Pink Palace and to have their own space and stuff like that. It was so life-affirming and, it's what Russell T Davies does so well.
Yeah.
And that, that kind of central episode of Colin's story and his death and, all the stuff with his mother was, so sad and so brilliantly done. It was so affecting. I remember just not being able to stop thinking about it for days.
Yeah, I would say if you watch this, or maybe if you just listen to this and don't feel like you want to watch it, I would really recommend a French movie that came out a few years ago, one of my favourite films. Sometimes it's called just BPM and sometimes it's called 120 BPM. And it is a story about the AIDS crisis in Paris and the activists with ACT UP. And it is just sensational.
Yeah.
I can't recommend it highly enough.
Yeah. Really, really good.
Let's talk about another movie, though. Our second barely Regal review. This is Promising Young Woman. And this actually has a stronger royal connection, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll find that hard to believe. But on one hand, as Tom was very excited about, it was directed by Emerald Fennell, who played Camilla in the most recent seasons of The Crown.
I care about Camilla.
But also, what really stood out to us is that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have hired the producer of Promising Young Woman, Ben Browning, as head of content for Archwell Productions and Archwell Audio. So we were so excited to watch this and see if it could give us any insight into what we can expect from the Sussexes' Netflix and Spotify deals, given that this guy's going to be at the helm.
Yeah, and having watched the film, I'm kind of like, wow, what are they going to do?
So, Promising Young Woman is about Cassandra, played by Carey Mulligan. She's a 30-year-old woman who works in a coffee shop by day and goes out at night to catch predatory men, We learn that she dropped out of medical school 7 years before the film started after her friend Nina was raped and later took her own life. And this is what drives Cassandra's crusade. Quick trigger warning, we are going to be talking about rape, sexual violence, and gender-based violence for the next portion of the episode.
Yeah.
Check the timestamps if you want to skip this part.
We get to see a lot of horrible men along the course of this movie, and I thought, like, while the finale, kind of the bachelor party section, has some of those kind of expected alpha male types, like Joe, played by Max Greenfield, the film as a whole really focuses on the nice guys and has all these performances by people like Bo Burnham, who's the main romantic interest, Ryan, and then, you know, like Adam Brody is the very first predator that we encounter, and even Chris Lowell, who we loved from Veronica Mars and Glow. He is not only a rapist but a murderer.
And Christopher Mintz-Plasse, McLovin from Superbad.
Oh yeah, I forgot about him. They're all so recognisable, and it's really like a credit to the incredible casting, because by having all these like familiar faces, you're in a constant state of like, no, not him.
Yeah.
I love him.
We have been waiting so long to watch this film.
Yeah.
And I think the trailer and the marketing and the surrounding press really build it as something quite different from what it was. It was presented as a rape revenge thriller, heavily influenced by the Me Too movement, speaking directly to a culture of toxic masculinity that permits and encourages violence towards women. But I think it was actually quite different when you watch it. I mean, certainly when it starts and you have that first scene with her and Adam Brody, and then it cuts to the next morning when she's walking with what looks like blood running down her arm, but it's ketchup from a hot dog.
Yeah.
You don't know how violent it's going to be, and is she killing these guys? What's going on? But it is kind of a tease in that way.
Yeah, I found it a big surprise that she doesn't kill or otherwise physically hurt any of these horrible guys that we meet. And I thought it was a very interesting choice for Emerald Fennell to make, that actually she was kind of scaring them, or she was putting them into a vulnerable position that they had been putting so many women into.
Yeah, so the twists are kind of a subversion of what you had expected. She doesn't actually kill these men. She doesn't pay a man to rape Alison Brie's character. She doesn't serve up the dean's daughter to the frat boys. She doesn't carve Nina's name into Al Monroe's body, but was apparently aware all along that he was going to kill her.
And obviously her death is like the biggest twist in the film.
Yeah.
And we were watching it and being like, is she really dead? I mean, it sort of was surprising, but maybe inevitable, because we see her subdue men just using her tone of voice. And, you know, she has a book full of notches of all the men that she may have done this to. And we never really see her with like a weapon to ensure her safety or anything like that. And I do think some people pointed out that it would be unrealistic for her to be unscathed after all these years of pursuing this crusade.
Vox had a really interesting debate section with a few of their film writers, and one of them, Constant Grady, pointed out that Cassie's not supposed to be a superhero, and frankly, if it were that easy to talk down a rapist twice your size, we could all do it. I wanted the film to take it seriously that Cassie was in real physical danger, and her death accomplished that feat effectively for me. It felt honest. And I agree, because I had seen a lot of discussion about this film. Obviously, it came out in America ages ago, and tons of people were talking about, like, oh, like, this is such a shallow girl boss feminism approach to this story. But I didn't get the sense that you were meant to be rooting for Cassie while I was watching it, especially that scene where she goes to talk to Nina's mother, played by Molly Shannon, and she is urging Cassie, like, pleading with her basically to move on, to get off this train and get her life together.
Yeah, I mean, all the people in her life including really great performances, I thought, from Jennifer Coolidge and Laverne Cox as Cassie's mother and her friend / boss. But they all showcase this concern that feeds into the film's title. So, here is a woman who is wasting her potential by blindly following this track.
Yeah, and I think that scene where Ryan catches her leaving the bar with Sam Richardson's character is meant to be pathetic.
Yeah.
You're not thinking like, you go girl. You're like, this is embarrassing.
Yeah.
I know the ending has been really controversial. And there's another part of that Vox discussion that I wanted to flag, where Emily Vanderwerf points out that in the original script, the movie apparently ended with Cassie's death. So that image of her body's burnt fingers was meant to be the final shot. But that Emerald Fennell wasn't able to get financing for that version of the movie. So she had to add this ending where the police basically save the day. And Emily Vanderwerf says, while Emerald Fennell has defended it in interviews, I can't help but see the ending as a bit of a fuck you in the whole affair. If Hollywood financiers, who are mostly men, won't make this movie without a triumphant payoff, then give them one so over the top that it's almost impossible to take at face value.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And like, as someone who enjoyed this film, like, I want to believe this reading of it. Because it doesn't make sense that, having spent the whole movie kind of showing us that the establishment really doesn't care about women or about punishing men for violence against women. So for Cassie then to trust the police to carry out her ultimate revenge or to deliver justice on these men, it doesn't make sense at all. It makes more sense for them to get away with it.
Yeah, and I think it would have been a stronger conclusion if it had ended that way.
Yeah.
There is another review by a writer called Aisha Siddiqui on her Substack that is very, very critical of the film. I don't agree with everything she says, but she has some very legitimate critiques. One of them is when she notes that Cassie's death lasts exactly as long as it would take for a woman to actually die this way, 2.5 minutes. Fennell learned this from her father-in-law, an ex-cop. Statistically speaking, cops are more likely to be assailants than resources. Most recently in Fennell's home country, they were quelling protests over a murder of a woman, Sarah Everard, which, like many others, was committed by a cop. In this film, it is the cops who rush in to save the day and deliver the conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a very good point. I liked the way Emily Vanderwerf kind of framed her reading of the ending as this like purposefully unbelievable fuck you, when she said, the framing suddenly becomes less immediate and more dreamlike. The story plays out not with the logic of reality but with the logic of a movie. The impossible becomes possible because that's what we expect in a movie. And yet the coup de grace here, somehow Cassie knew before her death exactly when to text Ryan for maximum chaos at the wedding, underscores just how unbelievable the whole scenario is.
Yeah.
Because we were looking at each other when, these texts were coming through to his phone, and we were like, oh, so you can, like, schedule how long the dots go for, and, like, all the pauses were so carefully choreographed.
Those texts, though, really perplexed me. And, like, we only watched this film last night, so I'm still sort of processing my thoughts on it. But I was wondering, during the film, I felt like we're meant to sort of have pity for Cassie the way that Nina's mother does. But then is that ending meant to feel triumphant? And actually, is she the girl boss superhero who masterminded this whole thing? And I can't really tell where the film lands on that or where we're supposed to land on that. I feel like it's sort of deliberately frustrating and unsatisfying.
Yeah. I would be really disappointed if the intention behind the film was this triumph after what the first, 80% of the movie was doing. It doesn't kind of make sense to me, I suppose.
I feel like the script in general could have been tighter. I know we were sort of looking at each other in disbelief. The moment when Alison Brie turns up with her phone from 7 years ago because she just keeps all her old phones.
Yeah.
Like, that's something that anybody does.
Yeah, I mean, especially as that kind of plot point could have been easily achieved in other ways. Like, I think it was on Last Culturistas podcast, they were saying that why didn't Alfred Molina's character, the repentant lawyer, have this video, given that he had, defended so many of the men involved in these trials? It would make sense for him to be, like, offering that up as a way of, like, trying to atone for his sins.
I do think, though, like, I really enjoyed how bold the film was, and the aesthetic of it worked for me. Like, I was very into the color scheme, the costumes. I liked her rainbow nails. I liked all that, the sort of maximalism of it, like the Roman numerals flashing on the screen, the soundtrack starting off with that remix of Charlie XCX's Boys was so good.
Yeah, and the string cover of Toxic that was like made to sound like all weird and stuff. I thought that was good because we've had quite a lot of that, like string covers of pop songs, like in Bridgerton and Dickinson and stuff. But this was like felt fresh, and I thought that was really good for a directorial debut. Yeah,
and I think, while I felt the script was a little bit messy, I think Emerald Fennell had a really good handle on the tone, and it does try to do a lot of things, and I think it mostly succeeds.
Yeah, and I think that she knew what references she wanted to pull from. Like, I really liked that scene where Cassie is sitting on her bed, she's looking at that slideshow of images of her and Nina, and I feel like those kind of scenes can really easily pull you out of a story because they seem quite, like, staged. But the way it was lit and scored, it felt like, this is, like, really drawing on, like, 90s, early noughties psychological thrillers and stuff. And it kind of made me feel like there was, like, a confidence to the directing that really, like, impressed me.
Yeah, and I think there was really striking imagery, like you said. Carey Mulligan was fantastic. Obviously, everybody's said that. She's winning loads of awards. I'd be delighted for her to win the Oscar.
Yeah, she was so good.
And yeah, I'm excited for Emerald Fennell. Wouldn't be giving her that screenplay Oscar, but I'm interested to see what she does next. But Tom, what does this mean for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle?
Are they going to be producing stuff that's as controversial and talked about as Promising Young Women?
I fucking wish. In my dreams. Can you imagine them doing anything like this?
No, not at all.
I'm fascinated in what drew them to this guy and what drew this guy to them.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of almost more interested in. I'm like, what does he see his job as? Like, what does he think he's going to be able to create with them?
I'll be dying to find out.
We should move on to our third piece of barely Regal culture.
The Great.
So the royal reasoning for this is fairly obvious. Like, the characters are literally royal, although they are Russian royals, not British.
But everyone speaks with a British accent.
Because that's how you show that people are royal.
Yeah, that's how it works.
It was filmed at Hampton Court Palace, which is a IRL royal residence.
Which we have been to, so when I was watching, I was like, we've been in that room.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
And that's also where The Favourite was filmed, so it's even linked to The Crown, because we had Olivia Colman in The Favourite in one of her 2 performances as British Queens.
It has a lot of links to The Favourite, because it was created by Tony McNamara, who co-wrote The Favourite with Deborah Davis.
He wrote this originally as a play, and it was also a film, and now he's telling the story as a TV show, because I think I read that he sees the story as going on for years, because obviously you have a whole reign to cover.
Yeah. So the show focuses on Catherine, who will become Catherine the Great, played by Elle Fanning, who marries the Emperor of Russia, Peter, played by Nicholas Hoult. Honestly, I don't know much of anything about Russian history. I don't think you do either.
No.
But we do know she'll become Catherine the Great and be involved in Peter's death. Fairly early on in the season, Catherine begins conspiring with one of her maids, Marielle, who's played by Phoebe Fox, and a sympathetic courtier called Orlo, who's played by Sacha Dhawan, when they decide to stage a coup.
And the performances are really good on the whole, I think.
Yeah, I'm so into Nicholas Hoult as Peter.
Yeah, like, he is very funny, but then also very chilling as well at times.
And he does so much with his little huzzah catchphrase.
Yeah,
he can make it mean anything.
Yeah, and Elle Fanning is so funny in this. Like, she has great comic timing.
And this is her first comic role.
It's really, really good. And she's also, like, very believable as this romantic person who gets a really sharp reality check when she's, like, dropped in the middle of the Russian court from Austria. And the show does a great job, I think, of showing her disorientation in those, like, first kind of couple of episodes.
Yeah, and I think it helps that Elle Fanning looks like a storybook princess in real life. I was really into the supporting cast, particularly Adam Godley as the bishop, Archie.
Yeah, he's so good. That bit where he licks his fingers.
Oh my god, I gasped.
I know, because like we knew this was going to be kind of like irreverent kind of take on period drama.
Shocking humour.
That really came out of nowhere and we were like, oh, okay.
In the first episode, yeah. Oh, we were also so delighted to see Jamie Demetriou from Staff Let's Flats.
Yeah, one of our faves. And I was particularly delighted to see his character, who's a doctor, preparing an ice bath for Nicholas Holt's balls.
Were you into Catherine's lover, Leo?
Sebastian D'Souza, very charming. Certainly a lot more charming here than he was in Normal People, where he came across as a total asshole. But yeah, I'm really into him. I think he is great, and I really believe their romance.
I was really a fan of the casting in general, though. I feel like, you know, we talked about the issue of like colourblind casting in Bridgerton and how we felt it kind of failed on doing justice to its diverse cast. And I feel like they have a much better approach in The Great.
Yeah. I think it has this similar tone as well to The Favourite, in that it uses a lot of modern phrasing and there's a lot of swearing in it. And I have to say that, like, even though I don't consider myself a shrinking violet, it's a bit too much for me, especially going on for 10 hours.
This probably sounds so rich. Like, we have so many 1-star reviews from people being like, they use such vulgar language. But I find that kind of humour very lazy. To constantly just go for, like, fuck as a joke is boring to me. That's like low-hanging fruit of comedy. And it really grates, particularly Nicholas Holt's character. Like, I really enjoy him, but, you know, we were binging it this week and it got to a point where I was like, okay, like, I've kind of had enough of this kind of humour at this point. And particularly as well with the, you know, I feel like it sort of struggles in deciding whether it wants to do that kind of lowbrow, crude humour or more kind of sharp-edged satire. So it can be kind of tricky to watch, particularly those really gross bits.
Yeah.
The Favourite had moments like that too, but they were much more sporadic. Whereas with this show, like, a lot of times I couldn't even look at the screen.
Yeah, it becomes quite overwhelming, I think, with the level of, like, gross, like, bodily fluids and stuff.
The scene with the mother's corpse, where the guy was fucking the mother's corpse, was a really hard no for me.
Yeah, it was rather outre.
I think it was beyond outre. It was beyond the pale for me, to be honest.
Yeah, and like you said, there were, like, elements of this kind of tone in The Favourite, but they were used so sparingly that they had, like, the right kind of impact, that they landed the joke, or they made you kind of recoil just enough. Whereas I felt like in The Great, it becomes overwhelming and it loses its cleverness.
Yeah.
Which is a shame because it's such a good premise for a show, and, you know, I like in general, like that approach to period dramas, it feels very right for now.
Yeah, and I think just in general, the shadow of The Favourite looms so large over this, and I loved that movie so much that it's hard to watch without comparing them. I do think what most distinguishes The Great from The Favourite is that it has much more of a sense of optimism. Like, it does get very, very dark at times, but I think in general it does feel a lot more hopeful. You get this sense of a hope for a better world in a way that you didn't in The Favourite. Like, The Favourite felt very bleak.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously Elle Fanning is a huge part of that because her character is so full of hope, and hope is the only thing that she has to cling to, really, in this like horrific landscape that she finds herself in. So she does a really good job of like bringing us along with her and managing to carry the whole show basically on that.
I think obviously if you are a fan of period drama, particularly the very lavish costumes and production design, this definitely hits the spot in that regard. I think it probably owes more to Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette than The Favourite visually. And I really liked the colour scheme. I liked those kind of recurring visual motifs with the bears and the figs and the lemons. Obviously all the wigs and the makeup and the wardrobe were just fantastic.
Yeah, I loved all the stuff about the, like, you know, all the scheming horrible ladies in waiting around the court. The way they have this like fashion of having the wigs perched on top of their heads at the beginning. I thought that looked so good.
Yeah, and Elle Fanning is just so beautiful that it's such a pleasure to watch her in these clothes.
Yeah. Oh, I love Leo's room with the tree planted in the corner.
Yeah, the foliage and all of that was really rich, very sumptuous to watch.
I do think as well that, like, while there are a lot of period dramas, obviously, that show how hard it was to be a woman in these times, and that also draw attention to the ways in which things haven't changed in some regards, I feel like The Great goes really out of its way to show the physical control of women's bodies at that time. Like, from that bit we talked about where Archie performs an examination on Catherine before she marries Peter, through to like the brutal beating scenes that we get, like when Mariel is beaten, and even the bruises that Peter leaves on his mistress's neck. Like, these are like actual marks that we see, that the camera lingers on, and that, like, I guess show that kind of subjugation and oppression in like very strong visceral terms.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of similar to Promising Young Woman in a way, in that it's trying to do a lot of things, and I don't think it's doing what it thinks it's doing, or it's not doing it as successfully as it thinks it is. And because The Great has such a tricky tone, and because it is so long, it can't sustain that the whole time. So it definitely feels over long to me, and I wonder would it have been better served by being half-hour episodes, or maybe 6 or 8 episodes rather than 10. It just feels like it's not tight enough.
Yeah, I mean, I particularly think that shortening the length of the episodes would do a lot, because you have the comic elements. The episodes will also have like something that is designed to make you really think as well, and I feel like because the episodes are so long, it goes between the two so many times within an episode that it becomes confusing, or it feels like it starts to drag.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, you know, it has such a lively pace, and it's like a very energetic show.
And the performances are so good.
Yeah, it sort of overstays its welcome a little bit. Just while you mentioned there that there are those more kind of emotional moments, one of the scenes I really liked was when they go to visit the front of the war and they bring those cases of macaron, those like pastel pistachios she's like putting it in the soldier's mouth because he's lost his fingers. Those moments, I think, tread that line very well.
Yeah.
But there are others where it falters, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, like, that's kind of inevitable when you're taking such a, like, strong tone for such a long time.
Yeah.
Like, I don't understand how you could sustain that successfully for the whole of that run.
In terms of the sort of representation of monarchy, this absolute monarchy is different from what is in the UK, but there are some similarities, I think. Like, there's that one scene where Peter and Catherine have to wave at the troops from a window.
Yeah, and, like, it really is shown for kind of what it is, which is, like, this pointless task that, you know, Peter doesn't really care about it. Like, he, like, snaps at Catherine to come and join him at the window, they wave, and then they immediately sit down and have a meal. Like, there's no, like, connection between them and the task that they're doing beyond, like...
box ticking.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, I think you have to view some of the stuff, if not all of the stuff, that the royals in the UK do as part of a ceremonial box ticking exercise.
I also think it's interesting seeing how Peter struggles with his popularity, and especially given his father was so beloved.
Yeah.
I was thinking a little bit of Charles and Will, and, you know, feeling like insecure about how their public feels about them and wanting to be loved and adored.
Yeah. And I can definitely imagine both Charles and Will trying to interpret their dreams as to what they mean about the, like, success of their legacy and stuff.
But they're filming the second season now, and I'm wondering, you know, I would hope that time in lockdown, maybe it was like a little bit longer than they expected between shooting seasons 1 and 2, so maybe they have more time to get a better grip on the tone. But, you know, do you think you would watch a second season?
At the moment, I don't think I would, but that could be because we've just watched a whole season and it's been quite intense.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like I'm done. What about you?
Yeah, I guess it depends. You know, I love a lavish period drama, and I don't know how many of those we're going to be getting for the foreseeable future. But yeah, I've definitely had my fill for now of this kind of humour.
But I definitely want to see all of these people doing more comedy in a way that I can see, just maybe not in The Great, you know.
I know, that name is so unfortunate as well, because, you know, if it doesn't live up to the title...
The Good, the All Right.
That's just there, isn't it? I think that about wraps it up for our Barely Regal culture catch-up. I enjoyed watching these 3 very different projects and talking about them with you, as always, Tom.
Thanks, I enjoyed it as well. It's always fun to, like, watch stuff through the lens of the royals, I think, or, like, how it could compare or not to what's been going on. So I really enjoyed that. And I think if there's other stuff that people want to hear us talk about that could be barely regal, we would love to hear that. We are kind of thinking we'd like to focus on stuff which is fairly current, but I guess we'll have to see how much stuff is coming out over the next little while.
Oh yeah, we've got one very exciting DVD on the way that we will talk about at a later date.
Yeah. Do we need to, like, buy loads of DVDs and then we can send them out to listeners?
Very rare find. But anyway, thank you so much for listening, and have a great week.
Bye.
Bye.
Huzzah. 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 Huzzah.